Hey, my name is Joby Martin. I'm the lead and founding pastor of the Church of 1122. We planted about 3 years ago, and God has been incredibly generous to us and has blessed us like crazy, and His hand of favor has been all over us. And one of the things I've been asked a lot about is accountability and authority in regards to church planting. And what I want to do is go to Matthew chapter 16 when Jesus launches the whole idea of the ecclesia or the movement or the church. And I know you're very familiar with the passage, but let me just remind you of it. It's Matthew 16, beginning in 13. It says, "Now, when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, 'Who do people say that I am?' And they said, 'Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets.' And he said to them, 'But who do you say that I am?' Verse 16, and Simon Peter replied, 'You are the Christ, the Son of the living God.' And Jesus answered him, 'Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven.'" Let me read that part again. "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." And so here we get this idea of church planting, that Jesus asked this fundamental question to his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" And when Peter answers with the gospel, then Jesus says, "Upon this rock," the rock being the proclamation of the gospel of Jesus Christ, "Upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it." There's a whole lot here. First and foremost, the proclamation of this idea of ecclesia or movement or church, it does not happen in the holy city. It happens literally Caesarea Philippi on the edge of the gates of hell. That most archaeologists believe that Jesus was maybe on this rock with his disciples, overlooking this pagan temple down below them, where a spring fed into this river. It created this smoke and steam, and they believed that this little cave that was there may literally be the portal whereby demons entered and exited. And Jesus, at that place, at the edge of the gates of hell, said, "This is where we're going to put the church." And the church would be rooted and founded upon the gospel. And here's what that means. If you make your church about lights and sounds in the show, you're not really running a church. It's really a three-ring circus. If you make it about a building, then you're really not a pastor. You may be a janitor. If you make it about you, then you've really got like a reality TV show and not a church. What Jesus is saying here is that it must be founded upon the public proclamation that Jesus Christ is Lord. And then the key here, I think, is in verse 19 when Jesus says, "I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." And so what that means, I think, is that Jesus, it's like he's walking around with this big key ring with a bunch of keys to the kingdom of heaven on it, and he is looking for faithful men that would proclaim that Jesus Christ is Lord, the Son of God. And what he is looking to do here with Peter is to hand him the keys to the kingdom of heaven. You see, what he found is he finds Peter, who has submitted himself under the authority of Christ, and it's only out from under that authority that Jesus gives him the authority to be, Peter, a church planter. So my question would be, so what about you? So what authority are you under? Because I'm just going to tell you. Look, I did 15 years of student ministry before I planted a church. I was like most youth pastors. I sat in the back row. I was hypercritical of everything the church did. Every time the church did something that I thought was lame, I thought, you know what? When I'm in charge, this is how I'll do it. And then one day, the Lord went, "All right, Scooter, now it's your turn." But the thing that I had going for me is I served under this incredible senior pastor. And what I did was submitted myself to the authority of this senior pastor and to a denominational church that I didn't even fully agree with ecclesiologically or even theologically in some open-handed areas. But that was the church where I was serving. And I was just faithful to serve there. I was faithful to be submitted to the authority of that church. And not because of anything that I did, but simply because I think I was under their authority, proclaiming the gospel. Then the senior pastor of our church basically looked at me, and instead of being so concerned about building his key ring to have a bigger and bigger and bigger key ring in the kingdom of heaven, he looked at me and said, "Hey, I want to hand you the keys. I want to hand you the keys to the kingdom of heaven, to a new church for you to plant. And it was out from under that authority that we planted the Church of 1122. And so I would encourage you to submit yourself to leadership, just like Peter did. I would encourage you to take the gospel to the edges of the gates of hell, not the safe places, not the holy city, but to the edges of the gates of hell. And that I would stay hyper-focused on the gospel of Jesus Christ, the declaration of the gospel. Because, lest you think you can't slip, in the very next passage, what begins to happen? What begins to happen is that Peter, as Jesus begins to lay out the gospel to Peter and say, hey, listen, I'm going to be arrested and tried and crucified. Then Peter says, no, not on my watch. You'll never be arrested. You'll never be killed. And then Jesus tells him, get behind me, Satan. And this is the Pope. So if he can mess it up, then we surely can mess it up. And so we must have that covering. And here's just the reality. Until you and I learn to live under authority, then we are never in place to be given authority. Until you have learned to submit yourself to the mission and vision of an existing church, then don't ever think that God is going to give you point leadership over the mission and vision and values of a new church. So learn to live under authority. Commit to stay gospel-centered, to build the church on the rock. Because Jesus promises, first of all, he promises that he will build his church. Your call is to make disciples. His call is to build his church. He also promises that his church, even the gates of hell, will not prevail against it. Now, your church, we'll see. We'll see next year if your church makes it or not. But the church, built on the gospel of Jesus Christ, launched out from under accountability and authority, that God has his hand upon that church. And then one of the things I would ask you very, very clearly is this. Are you sure you have a calling from God? Because a calling to and a running from are not the same thing. I meet a whole lot of church planners that really they just have daddy issues and they want to pimp out the church to try to meet those needs. That is, may we never, ever, ever do that to the bride of Christ. I also meet a lot of guys, and they just learned how to be really good at youth group. And then they realized that was kind of their deal. They knew what to say and when to say it. And then they got into college and the same sort of thing. And so they've just sort of been caught up in this momentum of self-gratification. And now they think, hey, the next thing that I'm going to do is plant a church. I would encourage you to do this, to close your eyes and picture what God has planned for your life. And if your vision for the church that you want to plant has to do with you on a stage and lights on you, let me tell you, brother, that is not God's vision. Because God is not about making much of you. He is about making much of himself. And so I encourage you to plant the church, the movement, this ecclesia of God upon the rock that Jesus Christ is Lord. To do that from under authority, to never ever waver from the gospel, to check your heart, to really, really check your heart and ask yourself, why am I so averse to having accountability and authority in my life? Understanding that God is never going to give you authority until you learn to live under authority. And then, when that happens, then go for it. Go for it. And the reason why is because Jesus is going to build his church. That weight does not rest on your shoulders. It rests squarely upon his shoulders. And he lets us know that his church will prevail.